Last night, we saw the confirmation of what I think a lot of us had been feeling for a long time, that the world has changed in 2023. New Zealand has changed fundamentally in 2023. And perhaps the people to recognise that first, ironically, were those people who are responsible for running this country, in particular the Labour Party cabinet, not so much the Greens, but Jacinda Ardern, Grant Robertson, Chris Hopkins, and those movers and shakers who at the end of last year clearly got together and put a stratagem in place, which I have to say, on the basis of last night's poll and also on moods around the country that I've detected, seems to have been relatively successful in terms of convincing New Zealand that Chris Hopkins is not only a new broom, but he's a new broom that potentially has the right to be Prime Minister in about 7 months' time. To help us interpret what is happening in the political sphere, the polls of recent yore, the policy bonfire, which I'm not quite sure you could describe it that way as yesterday, and what's likely to happen in the next 7 months, I'm joined by Dr. Bryce Edwards, a leading political scientist and also the founder of the Democracy Project. Bryce, good afternoon to you. Thank you very much for waiting on. Nice to talk to you again.
You too, Michael.
Okay, mate. I've tried to work out what happened last night, but I think one of the things that last night's poll does is confirm stuff rather than inform us, doesn't it? That the world's changed since Jacinda Ardern stepped down.
Yeah, and look, I really agree with the way you introduced this by saying how much things have changed and how Labour is actually under Chris Hopkins kind of acknowledging the mood of the electorate and answering it in some very key ways. And it's been rewarded for this and for both Chris Hopkins and Labour, and now they've taken over national in polls. But I would just point out that they're still only in the mid-30s, and so is National. And so we're quite a strange situation where the major parties are still struggling. They're nowhere near the levels of support that they used to have. This isn't normal for both major parties to be in the mid-30s. Normally you do have one of them, at least one, in the 40s. And of course, as we know, Labour won the last election with 50% of the vote, and in previous elections under John Key, National has managed to get near 50% of the vote. So I think people are coming back to Labour, but they're still really uncertain and really unconvinced by both Labour under Hopkins and National under Luxon. There's a huge amount of uncertainty out there.
It's a very, very, very good point you make. I was trying to think last night when I looked at the polls, Bryce, and I was thinking, this reminds me of the lead up to MMP, when there was a view that both National and Labour, certainly amongst a large number of the population, were part of the problem. Are you finding that as well in the in your travels too?
Yeah, look, that's a great point, and but I don't think it's as extreme as back in the mid-90s. I mean, I remember that Labour polling back then when they were sometimes polling about 15 or 20%. So it's not as bad as that, where we might suggest that there's no future for one of those Labour or National parties. They're a bit more like, more like sumo wrestlers. They're kind of leaning against each other. They don't really have a lot of dynamism, but they're not really falling over either. So they're still holding their place, but just not that impressive. So I certainly think that Labour's being a lot more impressive under Hopkins than Ardern. Labour was just totally out of sync with the population's thinking and was getting very distracted by a lot of pet projects and so forth. Chris Hopkins has just been so much smarter, and I'm sure that there's a lot of focus group surveys going on at the moment helping him see the way. And we keep on having these policy bonfires to get rid of those distracting things. We're seeing Labour try to position themselves as more of a party of the working class or ordinary working people. And I think Hopkins is able to plausibly do that in a way that Ardern was never able to. She just did not have that ability. And I think that's where that Luxon wanted to position National as a bit more of a blue-collar, Tory party, and that was working for him for a while, but now Hopkins has got that initiative back.
And it's a scrap for the middle ground, as you say, for the sort of lower middle class, upper working class, or working class of this country. Traditionally, where elections have always been fought in that centre ground, and it's a question of who do people in that centre ground most identify, which is the second part of last night's poll, which will have dismayed National. Their polling rating, actually, despite everything, and they've had dreadful luck over the last 5-6 weeks from a political point of view, has worked against them. But their poll rating has stayed where it is. Chris Luxon's poll rating, though, has declined. Significant. That's a significant drop last night. I think it's the worst it's been since he was actually elected as leader of the National Party. Does Chris Luxon have a problem?
Oh, absolutely, and I agree. It wasn't so much the party support of National dropping a few points. It was the fact that Luxon was already polling quite badly in terms of the preferred Prime Minister ratings, and he dropped, 5 points, and now 17. So that is a real problem because, people... it's not like we have a presidential election system where, we're voting for Hopkins or Luxon, but people do want to vote for a party that's led by someone they want as Prime Minister, and that's just not the case at the moment. So even National voters aren't saying that Luxon's their preferred person to run the country. And there was another poll that came out on Friday by Curio Research, and it asked about your favourability or unfavourability towards Luxon and Hopkins. And Hopkins' ratings were just going straight up. They were his favourability ratings were skyrocketing, whereas Luxon's were trending down. So it's a real problem when even National people, and as I said in that poll, actually quite liked Hopkins. So, I think there is a problem with the personnel on National. But, of course, as you and I know, once you start, talking about changing leaders, and there will be a bit of talk about that in National, it brings instability, it doesn't really project a sense of competence or unity, and, National won't want that in the election year to look like they are not up to the task of being a replacement for the Hopkins-led government.
And that's, I guess, is the next thing too, Bryce, is that National doesn't have any cards to play. You're not going to change your leader prior to the election. Are they? How far does he have to fall before that becomes an option?
At this stage, I don't see any change of leader on this polling. But if it does continue to go down, and if something happens and Nicola Willis's rating starts going up, that will get the National Caucus debating the issue of switching the deputy and the leader around. And sometimes these things have a momentum of their own. So, once people like you and I start speculating, on the radio, it sometimes drives up that conversation. So, very unhelpful to be having this conversation for National at the moment.
Yes, it is. But I guess in most cases, you could at least point to other people in the caucus and say, well, there's a potential successor in the wings. I looked at Nicola Willis's polling rights. She polled worse than I did when I was in Parliament for preferred Prime Minister. At 1%, she's not really a successor in waiting, is she?
I think she is probably the next leader. It might not be for a few months, or it might not be for 5 years, but I do think she's the best talent at the moment, and she's still finding her way. But I think she's quite talented. I don't know. I don't know if she's got what it takes, but I, like many other people, are starting to wonder whether Luxon is quite authentic enough and has the sort of sense of being a Prime Minister. He's very good at some of the sound bites, But, if I was a right-wing voter, I don't know how convinced I'd be that he is the person I want leading the country. So I get that a bit more from Nicola Willis, though.
It's funny you should say that, because I saw Chris Luxon in action at the Wanaka show, AMP show, 45,000 people there. He doesn't, and that was the thing I just said, he just doesn't strike me as prime ministerial. And normally you get either somebody like Helen Clark or Rob Muldoon, who's sort of that leader, or you get that instant affability, but he's in charge, like John Key. I'm not sure I get that with Chris Luxon. Just on that, you're talking about leaders, potential leader. What about Erica Stanford? She strikes me as being abreast of it. She's got the telegenics all together, and she's got a pretty clear message. Is somebody like that, do you think, in the wings as well?
Oh, absolutely. And Stanford, is very impressive. I agree. She's a bit more inexperienced, but she's rising fast. The problem potentially with both her and Willis is they're a lot more liberal and probably a lot more moderate. And at the moment, national, both the caucus, the support base is a bit more to the right, a bit more conservative. And Luxon does actually match up quite well with that. I don't know how comfortable both the base and the caucus would be with kind of a step to the left, and really taking on someone like those two women. They don't quite represent national as well as Luxon, I believe.
I think Stanford's got promise, though, I have to say, but they should choose it earlier rather than later. All right, moving on. Somebody else I saw at the show too, Bryce, was Winston Peters. So he was there pressing the flesh. New Zealand First had a tent. They had a number of their hierarchy there as well, going around, making sure they were visible and seen. Winston Peters was 3% in the poll last night, and so was New Zealand First. I think in the Curia poll, he got up to 5%. Whatever. He's not finished yet, is he? He's going to clearly run a campaign. He's clearly going to be in the mix on election night.
Oh, you're absolutely right, Michael. And it astonishes me that he's not taken more seriously in the media and in these polls. Because, yes, that 3% last night isn't enough to be back in power, but we all know that New Zealand First do very well in election year. They campaign well, and it's yet to be seen whether they'll hit the 5%. But if they do, that could change everything. In terms of who governs. And so I think we need to. In the media, and the press gallery, I think there's just a sense of wanting to believe that New Zealand First is over and aren't relevant, and instead they want to talk up the Maori Party or other possibilities. And I think the Maori Party are a force that needs to be taken seriously, because they could be the kingmaker. And so I'm not saying don't focus on them, but there tends to be a neglect of the role that New Zealand First and Winston Peters could play. And Shane Jones, I think, has also been very well at the moment. And sometimes Winston Peters just seems like he's still there, but he's not being very dynamic. Whereas Shane Jones, I get a sense of a renewed vigour with him that makes me think that he is ready to take over the reins at some stage.
You see, isn't it funny? I actually regard New Zealand First as a cult, and I was there at the start. So
Yes.
I think it's the cult of Winston. I think once Winston goes, New Zealand First collapses like a tent without poles. He's 78 years of age. He will be this year, Winston. Mind you, Joe Biden's going to be 80 this year, so...
Look,
I take your energy point, though.
I agree.
Yeah, carry on. Sorry.
Yeah, but also, I mean, there is a big section of the population that aren't very well represented by Labour and National Act and the Greens at the moment. These are people that are a bit more kind of anti-establishment, a bit more affected by some of the changes in society, especially the economy at the moment. I actually think the biggest threat to New Zealand First's chances are the fact that Hopkins and Labor have gone a bit more back towards working class people and are talking about some of those issues that affect people's back pockets, and that was going to be the route into power for New Zealand First. And so Labor's returning a bit more to its old-fashioned sort of social democratic and ordinary people focus. It's moving away from, I guess, how some people would say, moving away from the university common rooms back to the smoko room. And that might undermine New Zealand First's chances, but there definitely is a constituency there that needs representation in politics.
No, I think you make a very good point. And also the other thing, Bryce, is Chris Hopkins' continual, and it's been now parroted by people like Ingrid Leary, who we have on the program every Friday as well, who's always been on the left of that caucus, saying there's only one issue, and that's the cost of living. And that mantra now seems to be adopted in toto by the Labour Party. It's almost as if you've got an ideology, it's just a luxury we can't afford. And he's really getting that message out there. I've also noticed something else about Chris Hopkins, and I just wonder if this is deliberate. He's referring to New Zealand as New Zealand, not Aotearoa New Zealand or Aotearoa. Have you noticed that?
I certainly have, and it was apparent from his very first press conference on becoming leader. He referred to the country probably 10 times, not once using that alternative version. Likewise, Carla Spillane, when she was elected, she didn't use it. And this was not a coincidence. To me, it was a very deliberate move away, just giving us sort of a symbol or a kind of signal to people that, no, we're not the woke Labour Party of Jacinda Ardern. We're not the social engineering sort of, university common room party. We're going to go back to, just the basics and not try and, show how much we can, signal our virtue.
A lot of people, though, and perhaps with a degree of justification, Bryce, think that this is sort of wolf in sheep's clothing, that nothing's really going to change behind the scenes. And just as you were saying that, I was thinking about all those civil government bureaucrats in Wellington who, despite Chris Hopkins doing the front of show act, probably aren't going to be changing their policies, their formats, their Maori greetings, their co-governance regime anytime soon.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and this is a part of New Zealand society that you might call kind of middle class, or the consultancy class, or the professionals that have been a big support base of the Labour Party over the last decade or more, and I think they'll become a bit more detached from Labour. And maybe go back more towards the Greens. But, yeah, it's a good question. And I think there'll be lots of contradictions whereby government departments are much more out of sync with the rest of New Zealand than even the Labour Party are. And so, yeah, it could lead to some big backlashes. I think it's going to, that contradiction is going to lead to government departments losing their reputation, losing their sort of the trust of the public, which is a real big problem in a democracy.
Sure is, yeah. All right, Bryce, just before you go, you're writing a column which I think we're publishing. Is that an annual or a column that a weekly column that you'll be writing for the platform?
Oh, I try to write as much as I can about New Zealand politics, and I make it available to the platform to put up on the opinion section of the website. I just do it whenever I have time. So it's, I don't know, a couple of times a week normally.
How are you finding the Democracy Project going at the moment, by the way?
It's good. So I do that where I work at Victoria University of Wellington. It's kind of a labour of love. I'm really keen on getting information out, getting analysis out to the public about New Zealand politics and elections. That's what we're about, and it's about having conversations with people like you on the program.
No, I mean, and those are these are the important conversations. You're right in terms of teasing out what are the bumper sticker sort of 15-second soundbite issues. I wonder if. And certainly the conversations that would go very well in Victoria University staff club room as well.
Yeah.
Are we having enough of those conversations amongst real New Zealanders, though? Because I get the feeling that the dislocation you just talked about before between central government bureaucrats and between the rest of the country, it seems to be ever widening. And I thought Hawke's Bay in a funny sort of way, and the reaction to Hawke's Bay was a good example of that the bureaucrats ended up in the firing line in a big way because they were all talk and no work. Is that division likely to get worse?
Oh, look, it's happening throughout the world at the moment. So it's not just New Zealand. It's something that's been going on over the last few decades, where you have kind of the elite technocratic class of New Zealand that, believe they should rule. And then you've got a big distance between them and the provinces, people, in everyday jobs. So we see it in New Zealand that, I think the provinces are becoming a bit more like what you saw in the States with those kind of, what they call them in the States, the flyover states, the places where the politicians don't go. The politicians, just fly over top, especially the candidates for presidency and things like that. And it does lead to a lot of resentment and a lot of anger. And so you see things like Brexit in the UK as a result. You see the election of people like Trump in the US. Yep. So, I do think we are seeing people not really... It's a sense of social cohesion not being as good as it used to be. And there's anger, and it also breaks out in, things like the parliamentary lawn protest last year. There's a bit more suspicion and not the sense that we're all in this together anymore.
No, we're not a team of 5 million after all anymore, or if we ever really were. Bryce, thank you so much for your analysis. Really appreciate it. Great to have that kind of insight. All power to you. Bryce's column will be going up on the platform today, social platform, all our social media. He gives a really good insight into politics. As you can see, he's a very intelligent, considered man. And although you may not like what he says in terms of, I don't like that outcome, I think you would agree that the logical process that gets him there. Listen, can I just say, though, at the end of that also, the interview with Bryce just now, is that that concept of the elite technocratic class, it is, and Bryce has highlighted it, I see that on a daily basis now, and remember, I'm an elected local government official. But what's coming out of central government, what's coming out of local government, what's coming out of, in particular, education and the curriculum developments and things like that, there's a clear political social agenda that I think that you would suggest at the end of the day is not mainstream New Zealand. But the irony of all this is that mainstream media, and I don't mean to be nasty about this, but if I look at the stuffs, the Radio New Zealands, the Television New Zealands of the world, are part of that elite technocratic agenda and milieu as well. They drink at the same places, they went to the same universities, they were in the same debating clubs, they send their kids to the same schools. They live in the same areas, even the same suburbs. So unsurprisingly, they see the world the same way. And it's not really the same way as the rest of us. And the very fact that I talk about the rest of us gives you some indication of how much that division is becoming.